Good afternoon and welcome to today's New York City Council hearing for the Committee on Economic Development. At this time, please silence all electronic devices. No one may approach the dais at any time during this hearing. Chair, we are ready to begin.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's New York City Council hearing of the Committee on Economic Development. Today is September 22, 2025. My name is Amanda Farias and I have the privilege of chairing this committee. I would like to thank the members of the committee who are present today, Council members Riley, Bottcher, and Gutierrez, and the administration for joining us today for this critical hearing on the progress of implementing the new New York City Industrial Plan. On September 16th, the Department of City Planning released the draft New York City Industrial Plan, the city's first comprehensive industrial development strategic plan as mandated by Local Law 172 of 2023, which I was proud to be the prime sponsor. This plan represents the culmination of 18 months of research and stakeholder engagement, addressing the future of 545,000 industrial jobs across our 5 boroughs. Today's hearing provides a critical opportunity to examine the plan's proposals and ensure that they meet the needs of our industrial businesses and workers. New York City's industrial sector remains vital to our economy despite decades of challenges. While we've lost 75% of manufacturing jobs since 1970, our broader industrial sector, including construction, transportation, warehousing, and utilities, still employs 15% of the city's private workforce. These are good-paying jobs with manufacturing workers earning an average of over $74,000 per year. For the 80% of industrial workers who are people of color, these industrial jobs provide an essential pathway to the middle class. The draft industrial plan identifies 5 strategic goals with several specific recommendations, introducing a framework of primary industrial areas for core industrial uses and secondary industrial areas for mixed commercial industrial activity. These designations aim to provide protection for industrial businesses facing significant real estate pressure. Many industrial properties sell for over $700 per square foot in some areas, but most industrial businesses can only afford roughly $25 to $30 per square foot in rent. So we desperately need innovative solutions to bridge this gap. Several of the industrial plan's key proposals include activating the Blue Highway Initiative to shift freight from trucks to waterways, installing climate-resilient infrastructure on city-owned property, and creating 275,000 industrial green economy jobs by 2040. The draft plan also addresses several of the industrial sector's critical vulnerabilities. Half of our industrial land lies within flood zones, and many areas experience extreme heat, up to 8 degrees above the city's average. Tackling these challenges requires long-term planning and steady leadership to ensure they are managed appropriately. We appreciate the community engagement that has occurred to date, including responses from 570 businesses and regular stakeholder meetings. Nonetheless, we recognize that very real concerns remain. Several industrial business groups have complained that there still needs to be significant additional outreach to the city's industrial sector, as well as clarity on the boundaries of the planned primary industrial areas, and the development of meaningful financial incentives comparable to programs like FRESH. The upcoming town halls the Department of City Planning has scheduled will be crucial for gathering additional public input before the December 31st final plan deadline. Organizations like the Industrial Business Service Provider Network have also proven invaluable in supporting industrial businesses, but IBSPs cannot compensate for poor planning or market forces that may make retaining industrial businesses unviable. The plan must provide real tools and resources, not just aspirational goals. Today, we look forward to hearing from the Department of City Planning and Economic Development Corporation about their implementation strategy. We need to understand what recommendations can be provided and proceed immediately, how the city will support businesses facing displacement, and what specific changes industrial businesses can expect when this plan takes effect. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Economic Development Committee staff, Senior Counsel Alex Polinov, Senior Policy Analyst William Hongach, and Finance Analyst Glenn Martelloni for their hard work in preparing for this hearing. I'll now turn it over to our committee counsel to administer the oath. And I'd like to call up to the dais Jennifer Sun, John O'Neill, Carolyn Grossman to the dais.
Good afternoon. Alex Polinoff, Committee Counsel. Will all members of the administration today please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony today, and to respond honestly to council member questions? Great. You may begin when ready.
Thank you, Thank you, Majority Leader and council members, for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Carolyn Grossman-Marr. I'm the Director of Economic Development and Regional Planning for the Department of City Planning. I'm joined today by my DCP colleague, John O'Neill, and by Jennifer Son, Executive Vice President for Planning at the NYC Economic Development Corporation. And we're really pleased to be here today to share an update on the city's draft citywide industrial plan, which, as you mentioned, was released last week. I believe we have slides that are forthcoming. I want to make sure we give a moment for the technical team to bring them up. Great. Let's go to the first slide, please. Sorry, the beyond the title slide. Great. As you all know, this plan is required by local law 172, which was passed by the City Council in 2023. And I want to thank the council, and particularly you, Majority Leader, and Councilmember Gutierrez, for your leadership on this issue and for setting a really helpful framework under which we are producing this first of its kind plan. You asked us to create a comprehensive and long-range look at New York City's industrial jobs and lands. And we have tried to do just that, built over really 2 years of research, stakeholder input, mapping exercises, and peer city review, and a whole series of inputs. And the draft plan itself, again, as laid out by the legislation, provides a wealth of existing condition information and then offers recommendations, policies, and a land use framework to try and strengthen the industrial sector within today's New York City. This is an interagency effort. It is being led by city planning, but we have convened with agencies all across government, starting with our close partners of EDC, SBS, DOT, MOCJ, DEP, MOME, and many, many others, really the alphabet soup of agencies to make this plan as strong and as effective as possible, inclusive of the range of things we believe to be impacting the city's industrial sector. I realize we're not moving slides with me. So next slide, please. Great. There's all of our alphabet soup of agencies. Next slide. There have been several phases to the development of this plan. When the bill was passed, we kicked off an organizational planning phase to learn really and structure what an industrial plan could be, and to engage within the city government team to create a working structure for coordination. In the fall of last year, we kicked off our public learning phase, where we focused on receiving feedback in a variety of forms and setting a parameter for research and goals, culminating in the release of a preliminary existing conditions and preliminary goals statement this spring. Since then, we've been in the creating phase, working to put forward recommendations associated with each of the goals and strategies, which I'll discuss more in the presentation. And with the launch of the draft report earlier this week, and I really want to stress the word draft, we've kicked off a phase 3 for a refining phase. This means we're testing and finalizing strategies with the stakeholders, with many stakeholders in the public, especially through the plan's legislatively required town hall engagements, with the intent of releasing the final report as required by the end of the year in a way that continues to be refined and prioritized by feedback. Next slide. Development of the plan to date has already been grounded in engagement. We have collected over 600 responses to an industrial business survey. We've held over 50 one-on-one stakeholder meetings with various organizations. We've organized or attended and participated in 8 panels and workshops and led 10 walking tours of industrial areas all across the 5 boroughs. This level of input has really helped us identify and hear from on-the-ground experts about the real challenges and opportunities facing industrial businesses in the city. Next slide. The draft plan itself, clocking in at almost 100 pages and on your desk or available at nyc.gov/industrial plan, is structured around 5 key challenge areas. We have a bit of industry history in 101 at the onset of the document, and then we look at evolving industry, demand for space, congestion and trucks, public realm quality, and climate threats. We also have the analysis of survey results and other necessary context-setting information. And then we have a section which contains maps of the designated industrial areas, which are covered on a recommendation basis in Section 2. Next slide. We've also completed 2 companion tools to support this work. On the left, the Industrial Data Explorer is an interactive way to view existing conditions across the city and to see information about designated industrial areas in a toggleable and interactive map base. Available to the public. And we've also launched a new feedback tool, which can take the place of the Industrial Business Survey to really hone in and receive specific information about responses to the plan. Next slide. So a quick summary of what's in the Industry 101 section. We look here again at the total of industrial economic activity in the city, which is about 550,000 workers in 47,000 industrial businesses across the city, which, as the council member noted, is about 15% of employment in New York City. We look at a wide range of industrial businesses in the city under either making, moving, or maintaining spheres. And we also look at the geography in which industrial activity is happening. As a surprise to us in doing this work, industry is really everywhere. It is happening in our traditional industrial districts, but it is also happening in office areas, and it is also happening even in our residential districts. And we really drilled down into the geography associated with those allowances. And we take a look at the land use rules, which shape where and how different industrial businesses can operate in each of those settings. Next slide. Under our first pillar, evolving industry, we really look at the transformation of New York over the past several decades. So, as we all aware, we're no longer the global manufacturing capital that we once were as a city, but instead what we see is an industrial economy that has transformed into a diverse mix of logistics, construction, creative production, light manufacturing, and other industrial support sectors. And today, our metro region remains the second largest urban industrial economy in the United States, behind Los Angeles and Long Beach Metro. Our analysis shows that it remains a robust economy, with some sectors experiencing really significant growth, while others are stable or seeing some decline. And that, the industrial businesses are really central not just to today's economic picture, but to the transition to a green economy, looking at construction of renewable energy infrastructure, modifications of buildings, sustainable building technologies, to point out a few, that anticipate growth in industry going into the future, and remaining critical not just to our economic job growth, but to the city's functionality and underpinning other sectors of our economy. Next slide. So within goal one, section 1, we identify our first goal as being able to help, as a government, enable industrial businesses to continue evolving and innovating and to help transition to green technologies. We know businesses want to adapt. They often face really tough regulatory and resource challenges. Our strategies here focus on strengthening the government's ability to provide support directly to businesses, and that includes activating physical sites that can be hubs for green transition, using city-owned land for incubation, aligning our workforce development programs so that businesses can be recruiting locally and that we're preparing workers for the jobs of the future, and other specific business supports dedicated to that transition. Next slide. So within Goal 1, there are 5 strategies and 21 recommendations out of a total of 72 recommendations identified in the plan. I'll highlight just a few for today's purposes. We're looking at how the city can provide compliance support for Local Law 97, which is something we've heard a lot about being particularly challenging for industrial businesses that are hard to electrify. We're exploring the opportunities to expand clean energy infrastructure on industrial sites, to use publicly owned assets to create jobs and community benefits, evaluating existing tax credits and other tools to help businesses grow, and again, emphasizing focus on workforce development to make sure workers are trained and ready for jobs that emerge as we see industrial transition. Next slide. Our second challenge is regarding the demand for space. New York City today has more industrial land than any other city in the country, but much of our building stock is antiquated and really constrained. New construction is prohibitively expensive and complicated, so businesses often struggle to find modern and affordable space suited to their needs, even despite that large reservoir of land. At the same time, demand for space is really strong and companies want to invest here. Rising rents and limited supply are creating real headwinds. We are seeing, this for not just private service, but also essential city services that are also concentrating in our industrial areas, adding to that competition for extremely scarce and limited space. And in recent decades, we're also seeing industrial activity shifting more towards outer boroughs as this competition for space increases most intensely at the center of the city. Next slide. So our second goal is really around building a coherent land use and real estate strategy that's balanced. That means strengthening primary industrial areas so businesses can thrive, and really thinking about the areas where we are most exclusively retaining for only industrial space. But it also means thinking about how we build new space. We're looking at ways to catalyze investments to leverage mixed-use development that includes industrial activity, and also to streamline city processes so it's less complicated to site city operations. Ultimately, again, that goal really is about striking a balance to make sure industry has room to grow while fitting into the broader urban context. Next slide. So within Goal 2, we have 4 different strategies and 12 recommendations. A few of those recommended here really start with creating this new land use framework to guide investment in our manufacturing zones. We recommend identifying priority areas for new industrial neighborhood studies that can unlock future growth potential, and launching a study specifically on vertically integrating mixed industrial residential development models in order to continue to understand how we can deliver those kinds of developments in safe and feasible ways in our dense context of the city. We're looking at streamlining city approval processes for difficult-to-site operations. And each of these is really around recommending updates to outdated regulatory systems so the industrial sector can have the space that it needs to compete. Next slide. So a little bit more, we're really excited about this updated perspective land use framework that it really helps us think about the prioritization of industry in land use policy, something that we really lack tools for today. So within this plan, we're introducing 3 new categories. First, primary industrial areas. As the bill helps us identify, these are areas that are near highway access, rail, and port access, and have a predominantly industrial character today. And places where we would really look to preserving for for wholly or nearly wholly industrial use, and really strongly preference and restrict other kinds of uses going forward. Second, our secondary industrial areas. These are places where we have a mixed industrial commercial profile today, where we're thinking about maintaining them and really continuing to unlock them as job centers. And finally, other M zones, right? Other places where we have M zoning, but we haven't designated. These are often places where we have the most mix of industry, often near transit centers, often near residential areas. These are places where we really want to make sure we are accommodating industrial use within that broader urban fabric. And that really means looking at how our mixed use rules are working to continue to support the potential for industry with other uses in place. And we think that this framework and this calibration and hierarchical structure allows us to respond to the different kinds of local contexts that we see throughout the city. Our really solid industrial campuses, our mixed sort of innovative job centers that may have a lot of different industrial or commercial uses, some of which blend together quite seamlessly, and our more mixed use pedestrian and residentially focused neighborhoods. Next slide. Our third challenge is around congestion and freight. Almost all of New York's goods continue to move by truck, and that activity is concentrated on a few key bridges and freight routes throughout the city. Businesses constantly tell us that the traffic and road conditions are one of the biggest challenges to operating here in the city. It not only does it challenge their operations, comes with traffic safety and environmental justice concerns for those living and working in and near industrial districts and significant truck traffic. We see that crash rates are highest along many of our truck routes, and the growth of e-commerce and last mile deliveries is exacerbating the challenges here. Next slide. So our third goal is really to support modern and efficient freight movement throughout the city. The strategies here include expanding maritime freight and rail freight in order to take pressure off of city roadways. We're also looking, I think we maybe missed one slide. That's fine. We also are looking at encouraging the use of micromobility for cargo, maximizing efficiency for truck operations, and investing in decarbonization of truck fleets. The idea is to create a system where goods can move reliably, efficiently, and sustainably. And many of these proposals are reflective of active strategies currently being pursued by the Economic Development Corporation and Department of Transportation. There are 5 strategies and 14 recommendations in this section. Some of those recommendations include assessing changes to the truck route network, exploring expansion of freight rail system, investing in infrastructure for micro-distribution hubs. The Blue Highways Initiative is a promising effort being led by EDC, which hopes to shift freight off of our roadways to waterways. And we also want to build on existing programs like Clean Trucks to accelerate the shift to lower emission fleets. And we think that these strategies, again, modernize freight movement and improve the quality of life in surrounding neighborhoods. Next slide. The fourth challenge is public realm quality. Industrial areas, often have a lot of different users. Whether there are over 100,000 people who live in our industrial areas, hundreds of thousands of workers, students, many users exist in these areas, and we hear from all of them that there are really rising complaints about the conditions that people find. Everything from sidewalks blocked by trucks, trash, cleanliness, public safety. These issues aren't just cosmetic. They're materially making industrial operations harder and areas less attractive to customers and business operators. And so we really wanted to look at solutions to improve the quality of life in these areas while keeping industry functional. Next slide. So the goal here is to promote clean and safe industrial areas. We're looking at design toolkits, how to enhance the appearance and cleanliness, and improving environmental protections to help these areas really feel safe, functional, and welcoming. Next slide. Goal 4 contains 3 strategies and 5 recommendations, and some of these include adding a freight-inclusive street design strategy and typology into the city's street design manual so that we can ensure that our roads are working better for everyone. We're also looking at partnerships with local organizations that could support sanitation, safety, and marketing in industrial areas. And we'd also like to look at in zoning performance standards to reduce conflicts between open uses and provide regulatory clarity. And we think these kinds of changes could make a big difference in the daily experience of businesses and communities. Next slide. Our 5th challenge area is climate threats. Industrial areas are often located along the waterfront in parts of the city with very little green space or cooling infrastructure that makes them especially vulnerable to 2 risks: flooding and extreme heat. On the flooding side, as the council member noted, 50% of our industrial areas are in the floodplain. They're exposed to coastal storms and stormwater issues. And on the heat side, these areas tend to have large expanses of pavement and rooftops, high energy use, and very few trees. And that combination is contributing to a real divergence in heat effects that is directly located in our industrial areas. And so, while these areas are essential to the city's economy, they've also become some of the most climate vulnerable neighborhoods that we have. Next slide. So our 5th goal is really to prepare industrial areas for climate threats. And we're looking at 3 main strategies: improving stormwater management in the public realm, inclusive of streets, sidewalks, and open spaces; helping businesses and critical infrastructure themselves adapt to withstand flooding and extreme weather; and to tackle the heat urban island effect by exploring ways to bring cooling and green infrastructure into these areas. Next slide. Under this goal, there are 3 strategies and 10 recommendations. Some include evaluating the feasibility of new kinds of green infrastructure like bioswales or permeable pavement along industrial rights-of-way that could help with stormwater management while being sensitive to the kinds of operational needs of an industrial area. We're recommending looking at potential changes to tree planting requirements so that more industrial projects could include street trees. And we want to support major coastal flood mitigation projects that protect waterfront industrial areas. Next slide. So that's the substance of the plan. I want to talk a little bit about next steps. In order to gather more feedback and in order to be in compliance with the law, we will be engaged in refinement throughout the next several months, really led by hosting the 5 borough-wide town halls this fall. These will be sort of science fair style events with interactive boards and topic stations with a whole team of city experts to help unpack the data and engage with the public about what is happening in our areas and what recommendations we've made. We want to make it as easy as possible for people to explore these issues and receive input. We are in the process of spreading the word about these opportunities, and I'll just note what is on the slides. The first will be on October 9th in Manhattan at BMCC, in Brooklyn on October 16th at NYU Brooklyn in downtown Brooklyn, CUNY School of Law October 23rd, the Staten Island JCC on October 28th, and Bronx Borough Hall on November 6th. These are all evening meetings. They'll all be quite welcoming events. And we really hope that the council will help us and all stakeholders will help us publicize these events and come participate in the opportunity with us. Next slide. And beyond the town halls, we have this online feedback form, the Industrial Data Explorer, and a number of different ways to get in touch with the team. And we're really looking forward to hearing as much feedback as we can, and really feel that the more perspectives we hear, the more refinement the plan can have over the next few months. Next slide. That's our overview. Thank you for the time, and again, thank you for the partnership. And I'd like to turn it over to the council for questions.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I'd like to begin by acknowledging we've been joined by Councilmember Rafael Salamanca virtually and Councilmembers Vernikoff and Aviles in person. So after nearly 2 years of outreach, you received only 570 survey responses. I know we were all profusely working on how to get more people engaged and participatory in the survey responses. I know myself personally and members of this committee all really committed to try to help with that outreach. But that was really out of 47,000 industrial businesses that we have in the city. So what do you folks think explains the low response rate from the survey responses?
Yeah, I think, thank you for that question, Councilmember. I think what we heard from experts in industry and then encountered quite directly is that this is an industry that is really challenging to reach. And that I think that's what we experienced here. I think, as you know, the city both did extensive outreach ourselves. I know the council themselves also helped us try and reach out directly to businesses. We also had SBS, through its contracts with our industrial business service providers, provide additional funding to assist in the outreach to businesses. And I know that many of our organizations, well, that may not have turned around to a full survey completed response, still resulted in important touch points with industry. So I think we can be pleased by the amount of outreach that was done, even if the numbers are still a small fragment and sample of the full industrial business world we have. I would also say the business survey was quite in depth. And it did require some significant time to engage with. It was not a lot of yes or no questions. We tried to get real information on how businesses were operating in the city and the challenges they were experiencing. And so in the responses we got, there's a real depth of information that I think tells us an awful lot about what's happening, and a richness of experience that we think is quite representative, not of 47,000 businesses, each of which has its unique story, but it tells us a lot. And I think we found that information to be really enriching and helpful to the process. And so we're proud of the work that was done to receive that. But we did anticipate this would be a hard group to reach. And I think the sample that we've gotten is pretty useful.
So do you think there's going to be additional outreach in the next 3 months to try to make that number a bit bigger? I know, I think you're right in terms of the survey being more in depth was a little bit longer for folks to take on, and those that committed to it really committed because they had to go really into detail. But I guess for me and my purposes, of like 570 out of 47,000, granted we know we're likely never going to get 47,000 responses. Like, how do you think we can bolster that number up, get it closer to 1,000 or get it closer to 850 to feel as if we have a better idea? And on top of that, do we know if, as an agency, we've looked at the breakdown of responses? Is it predominantly Brooklyn? Is it predominantly in certain areas or certain?
We'd be happy to get that information to council member. I think we provided it a few months back, and we can pull a new cut. There are definitely areas where some of the response rates are higher than others, and I think that reflects experience on the ground of how active those business communities are. For instance, I can recall that North Brooklyn and Long Island City industrial clusters had fairly significant rates. And again, I think that's a testament to the service providers in that area and the outreach that they did, as well as the level of awareness and activity of the business communities in those areas. There were responses all across the city, but those are two that I know stood out to us. I think the new feedback form is much simpler and asks much more, less trying to get a real synopsis of business operation in the city and a much more, short touch points that I think will alleviate that burden of concern. And I think over the next few months, we do have another opportunity really to get as many people engaged in this process as possible. And that's certainly our commitment. I think also now that there is a plan to respond to and information that may draw in some new audiences. We're certainly hopeful.
Okay, great. Thank you. The plan contains over 70 recommendations, but no implementation budget. What is the total estimated cost for implementation?
We do not have a budget for the implementation. And I would say it is really our hope, working with the council member and other stakeholders, to think about at not just refinement of the recommendations. We want to hear where we got some right, where we got some wrong, what we missed, but also prioritization. There's a lot in here, and likely to do everything that this plan, this is a real long-term plan. So it's not one that we anticipated having an immediate estimate for. Some things in here the city is already doing, right? There's a lot in here around the Blue Highways Network, which my colleagues at EDC can speak about. Some of this, I think, are building on existing efforts. But I think we really have to look at the full picture and understand what an action agenda might be, and where we're implementing to really understand those trade-offs.
What of the major recommendations do you think can proceed without any funding currently?
I would have to get back to you, council member, but even any recommendation would ultimately have a staff cost associated with it. So even those that are more regulatory in nature, I think have some cost associated with it. So we'd be happy to. I wouldn't want to speak out of turn without our budgetary teams.
Okay.
And it is worth noting that this entire planning effort was done without any additional budget allocated. We did that by really using the resources of existing staff at agencies. Mm-hmm. We're very proud with what we do, but of course that is always a limitation.
Okay. Who has final accountability for implementing the industrial plans recommendations. We know that the final plan is due December 31st. As you mentioned in your testimony, it's just over 3 months away. Are there parts that maybe are not quite ready? And are you hoping that from the town halls that's going to, the details that come from those town halls be incorporated into this tight timeline that we have?
Yes, that is absolutely our intent. We've built the public engagement process as the bill requires, and I think the council was quite thoughtful on the timeline here to allow us to include additional engagement throughout the fall and to continue to make any refinements into the final plan before the final report is issued.
And who's accountable for implementing it? The final plan? Is it DCP?
I would say the full administration. The breadth of this plan covers the activities across multiple agencies in different parts of government. And so, any implementation of the recommendations is really specific to which part of government we're talking about. City planning is helping to put forward the coherent vision here, but implementation of any and all of these recommendations is a real whole of government exercise.
The draft industrial plan shows that industrial rents at $25 to $30 per square foot, but new construction needs are $60 plus per square foot. What financial tools will you folks deploy to bridge this gap and prevent any displacement of industrial businesses?
Sure, I think this is a huge challenge, right? That we're seeing that the what industrial businesses can pay and what it costs to build new space is there's a real divergence. The city has some financial tools, which I'll turn to my colleagues at EDC to speak about, on how we defray the costs of new construction to help balance that gap. One tool that we have only deployed in a very limited way yet, as the council knows, is new zoning districts that provide for industrial incentives. So through the City of Yes for Economic Opportunity, we created a new vocabulary for M zoning districts that have only been mapped in the Midtown South rezonings in some really limited perspectives, but are also being piloted in the Jamaica and Long Island City rezonings in front of the council right now, and we hope will become more useful in continuing industrial efforts going forward. Particularly, the M2A districts are looking at creating a mix of commercial and industrial, but bonusing the creation of new industrial space. And so that is one thing that we can do through land use tools to try and encourage a developer to sort of cross-subsidize within a job-creating project by giving them essentially free extra space for the inclusion of industrial. So we're excited that may be helpful, but I think the cost of construction remains a real barrier here for private industry. Jen, would you like to say anything about the IDA?
Yes.
Other incentive programs?
Yes, I want to start with the Industrial Development Association Agency, the IDA, that does provide discretionary tax benefits by lowering the mortgage recording tax, waiving city and sales tax, as well as providing property abatements for eligible costs, which include, acquiring and investing in the renovation of industrial space. So that will continue to be a very important tool for supporting the modernization and development of industrial space, especially on privately owned sites. We've also seen success in the use of the Industrial Developer Fund. So almost $40 million has been deployed to nonprofit industrial developers to create industrial space. Most of that was in the form of city capital. Over $30 million was distributed in the form of grants, and then about $7 million was dispersed in the form of low-interest loans. We will be interested, I think, in the fall outreach of the draft industrial action plan in hearing whether there's continued interest in having access to an industrial developer fund, in addition to really using the industrial action plan as an opportunity to really further our marketing and outreach to industrial site owners of the availability of these tools.
Thank you for that. Many industrial businesses report that existing incentive programs are a bit too complex. How will you improve industrial business engagement in programs like ICAP and REAP to make sure more businesses get to take advantage of these incentives?
We've heard some initial feedback about how there are barriers to entry and understanding that these programs exist and also how to apply for them. So I think one of the recommendations is about streamlining that process, making it relatively easier to be able to submit an application. And then also with the IDA staff, once an application is in the queue, providing a lot more staff support in taking that application through the process and doing it in a more streamlined and sort of time efficient way to the extent that we can control that so that we're being as, sort of business friendly in the application process as possible.
If I may add on that as well, I just echoing what Jen has said, that I think a lot of the feedback we heard was both about accessing the incentives themselves, but also the sometimes bewildering process of putting together multiple incentives for really idiosyncratic kinds of industrial uses, and finding government staff that could really understand those idiosyncratic challenges of an individual business, and help them put together that bespoke package. And I think that really speaks to both the work of SBS, the work of EDC, the work of the IBSP partners, and really thinking about how we optimize that relationship so that any individual business coming in is really understanding the wide range of supports that can work for their specific need. And also that any lessons learned from their process are feeding into the larger process of regulatory reform or back-end improvements. And we have a couple of recommendations that are specific to both of those, but I think it really speaks to the doing what we can to deepen or improve our incentive delivery itself, improving the business support structure for helping businesses access the resources, and improving the government's own regulatory reform response to inputs from businesses. And those are really three separate governmental activities that we think could all improve.
I appreciate that response. I do think too in the last couple of questions, and I feel a lot of this is leaning on budgetary associated line items that are going to come down to how do we actually make sure those budget line items end up in our final budget as a city, along with I'm hearing a lot of us leaning on our IBSPs. It's like 2 budget cycles in a row where I've been fighting for expansive dollars, not just on my own. All of us have been fighting for expansive dollars for IBSPs. We're leaning on them a lot. That is their role, and that's what we hope they continue to do because they are the ones filling the gap for what the government cannot do for our providers or small businesses. But yet, I did not see a lot of support asking, or at least support with my ask to the administration to get a larger budget for them. So I would, say to you folks, I'm stressing that as we approach this next budget cycle or even a January plan with this administration that they have to prepare for, maybe any support coming on your end on those expansive dollars and filling that gap that we need would be helpful. The plan also calls for an interagency working group that includes the Department of Finance, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Small Business Services, and the NYCDC, among others, to identify that these incentives be improved to better stimulate industrial business activities. Why didn't we convene the working group as part of the plan and have the recommendations ready to include now?
Well, just to be clear, the agencies have begun their work of identifying incentives and the analysis of what incentives might be improved. We were not ready at this time to go beyond the recommendations as they were described. So we have described a more formal process for continuing that work. But the agencies have begun to speak to each other. A lot of the incentives that we have in the city are controlled by state legislation. And so I think part of the thinking here is really making sure that the entire administration is aligned on what improvements would be most vital, in advance of any requests that may require a legislative change or other kinds of administrative changes. And that work can be quite sensitive, and is not. It would be premature to make more substantive comments at this point.
Okay. I'd like to be kept in the loop on the state jurisdictional items, because as we approach those conversations every budget cycle with the state, I can make sure to elevate those along with the other members of this committee to our state partners. The Industrial Development Loan Fund is currently available to businesses up to 400,000 square feet. How is that square footage determined, and are there plans to expand the IDLF to businesses with a larger footprint?
I wasn't aware of the square foot threshold, so thanks for making me aware of that, council member. And that's something that we can talk about with our team. Is whether that's one of the things that we look at addressing as a part of taking a fresh look at making sure that that IDLF is as accessible as possible.
Yeah, we want to make sure that that's actually reflective of, and maybe these 570 reports that the feedback we got back on surveys can help us with that, but that would be
I
great.
will say to that, actually, a lot more of the feedback we got was about smaller businesses accessing the program rather than larger businesses. Many larger businesses, from we've seen, I think, using it have been generally larger businesses, but perhaps not the most large.
Okay. Since 2015, DCP and the mayoral administrations have maintained a policy to not allow any applications for residential rezoning within the city's industrial business zones. The policy of maintaining IBZs exclusively for commercial and industrial use has been effective in stabilizing conditions and preventing displacement pressure on businesses. Does DCP agree that maintaining certain industrial areas for no residential zoning is important for the stability of these areas?
We do, and the framework we've put forward it's actually more nuanced than one we've had in the past, in really thinking not just about where residences may not be appropriate, but also where other commercial businesses may not be appropriate. And that's really based on feedback that we've heard from the industrial business community for a long time, that there are some cases where our existing M districts, which are widely permissive of non-residential uses, themselves can be introducing conflicts that are making industrial operations harder to thrive. And so the new three-part system is really thinking about those areas where actually we should be even more restrictive than we have been in the past, to really protect those most critical industrial campus type communities of the city, but also those areas where we think industrial and commercial can thrive. And also it makes important revisions to where we think industrial prioritization may not be necessary. The industrial business zones themselves were put together 20 years ago, primarily as a tax policy, and have become a sort of land use policy through verbal commitment. And that's something we think this bill really gives us an opportunity to rethink and reset, not by eroding the promise of protected areas. We think that philosophy is critical. But by making sure that we have a transparent and thorough process, as we do here, towards making sure we're directing that correctly at the right geographies based on real data about where our industrial businesses are, where our infrastructure is, where our growth opportunities are at. Because we also want to make sure that all of our areas of the city are contributing in economically productive ways. And we recognize that this is all really trade-offs.
And is it correct that the plan proposes to replace IBZs as this geography with the proposed primary industrial areas?
The plan has not actually made any formal recommendations about IBZs, except as a tax policy, which is their formal role. But we are recommending this new way of thinking about where different kinds of land use mixing may or may not be appropriate.
Okay, and has DCP calculated the area and the number of industrial businesses and jobs within the IBZs compared to the primary industrial area?
Yes. I'm not prepared to share those facts and figures here today. We'd be happy to follow up with you.
Okay.
But I can say that the area of preservation represented by the primary and secondary areas is larger physically, and I believe larger in terms of total number of jobs than that is covered by the IBZ tax boundaries today.
Okay, and would residential rezonings be considered as the secondary industrial areas? Because the plan wasn't.
No,
Plan
the
language wasn't
secondary
clear to me.
areas we've also said would not generally be appropriate for residential. What we have said is that an area that is not designated is one that may, in some circumstances, be appropriate for residential. Now, I want to step back and say all rezonings require ULURP, and ULURP lays out a whole
Currently.
series.
Currently, but the charter revision questions could change that dynamic. Or yes,
I'm not prepared to
sorry.
think through the implications of that question. But yes, what we are anticipating here, we're talking about areas where residential is not allowed by the underlying zoning. We're talking about the conditions under which somebody might contemplate any future rezoning. And there are a lot of reasons why different uses may or may not be appropriate. For some time, as you indicate, we have said that the existence of the IBZ boundaries are a reason for not contemplating any rezoning to residential on the basis of an industrial policy prioritization. What we're saying here is a little bit more nuanced, but thinking about the areas that are undesignated as really not contemplating where industrial preservation would be the purpose of not of holding back a rezoning policy consideration. There may be other reasons. There are lots of places where residential zoning may not be appropriate for other reasons, but we're trying to make a prioritization here about where industry itself is most prioritized by the city, and then where it is not. And we've put forward draft maps that we expect there will be a lot of feedback on whether we've gotten that geography right. I'm sure I feel quite confident it's probably not 100%, but we feel really confident in that idea of the three-part structure and thinking about our most prized, industrial nothing else areas, our areas for job centers where there's a mix, and then our areas where a lot of different flexibility might be possible.
You answered my next two questions about the boundaries and whether or not you folks will be considering any changes for the final plan. Seems like you're all open to it.
Yeah, we're 100% that this is a draft that we're looking forward to a lot of public feedback on.
And how do you folks think ongoing projects like the Brooklyn Marine Terminal or the IBX corridor affect these designations?
Sure. We took both into account in making the maps, but I'll turn it to Jen to speak about BMT.
Yeah, so we coordinated about the industrial action plan to make sure that it's consistent with the BMT vision plan, which contemplates investing in 60 acres for a modern all-electric port. So the proposed designation of that area in the draft industrial action plan is that those 60 acres are designated as primary industrial area. Then we also acknowledge that as a part of the vision planning process for BMT, we have created opportunities to create modern and light industrial and also heavier industrial space in Atlantic Basin. So we've designated those areas as secondary industrial because those industrial spaces are situated within a more mixed-use industrial and commercial area. So we believe that our designations for the Brooklyn Marine Terminal are consistent with the definitions under the draft industrial action plan. So that altogether, over 70 acres would be either in primary and or secondary industrial areas.
Okay.
And if I may, Councilmember, just to add, what BMT has done from a land use planning perspective, we see as a microcosm of what this plan is really trying to do, right? Not rely on sort of past designations, but really think about how do we create new industrial space? How do we leverage other uses to help us create more industrial space? How we juxtapose those uses really closely together, including meeting our housing objectives as a city. We really think that that's the mentality that the entire plan is trying to take.
Got it. The plan also states that 96% of M zone land is capped at 2 FAR and 20% of buildings are already non-conforming. The council had worked with DCP to create new M zones with greater FAR and more reasonable parking and loading requirements as part of City of Yes for economic opportunity. Yet the old M zones that cause these deficiencies are still in place. Has DCP considered a citywide action to update M zones, or will DCP only consider updating industrial zoning on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis?
Well, I would say first the plan recommends updating, and I think you're correct to read it. I think it is very much our understanding that the old M zones are holding back a lot of our districts, and that we've made some attempts to link the thinking about the framework to the new tools, right? That we think that when we're talking about our primary areas, we think in general an M3A may be an appropriate designation. We think when we're talking about secondary areas, we think the M2As may be appropriate. So we have those tools in mind. We are mindful that when we talk about the intricacies of zoning in any given neighborhood, we can't bypass really important stakeholder engagement. And so there's a component of neighborhood planning that must be done with neighborhoods as partners. Whether that means there are technical ways or environmental ways to consider, larger actions, it's something that we're certainly interested in. We've certainly seen value in this administration of more citywide actions. We certainly think that some of the needs for industrial zoning improvements merit citywide consideration as evidenced through this plan. But we don't yet know for implementation how those actions should work and how we make sure that we're honoring really the process that we go through with neighborhoods to think about growth opportunities with those citywide objectives.
Okay. The plan also projects 275,000 industrial green jobs by 2040. What are the annual milestones, and how many have been created as part of the Green Economy Action Plan?
Oh, so the Green Economy Action Plan, I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question again, Councilmember?
Yeah, so the plan projects 275,000 industrial green jobs by 2040. We're looking at what are the annual milestones and how have they been created as part of it.
So the Green Economy Action Plan has lots of policy recommendations that are at different stages of implementation. I would have to ask my colleagues for a progress report about how we're performing against those recommendations. But I know that we're making a lot of progress, for example, in supporting the Climate Innovation Hub, for example, at the Brooklyn Army Terminal, creating a BATWorks there that can really support startups and more mature companies, industrial companies, in really planning for climate change sort of resiliency in addition to creating quality jobs.
Okay.
I do want to note that I think the characterization of the statistic is a bit, as I heard it, incorrect. The 275,000 is of the 400,000 future jobs. Those are, first of all, those are forecasted, not promised, right? This was based on an evaluation of economy, not a specific plan from EDC on the growth of those jobs. But more importantly, those jobs include jobs that are transitioning. So it's a reflection of many of our existing industrial jobs becoming green in nature,
Sure.
and not the creation of new jobs. As we know, the industrial economy of the city has not been growing at a significant rate at all. It has been stable, which has been good news in recent years, but we do not have forecasts that expect nearly that magnitude of future growth. We do expect that magnitude of transition, changing the nature of jobs, that adaptation, which is really what Goal 1 is significantly focused on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of the point of what I was going to get to. Is this actually going to be creating any new jobs, or is this going to be a reclassification of jobs that are being transitioned from one title to a next? So thank you for clarifying that and reiterating that. And obviously, I look forward to following up. We all are trying to keep up to date with how these plans impact some of these larger initiatives that we have rolling out into the city. So I just have a few more questions and then I'm going to kick it over to colleagues. Blue Highways promises to remove thousands of truck trips and create 8,000 jobs. What specific sites are ready for activation today, if any? When will the Hunts Point terminal, be operational? And how much funding has been secured versus what's still outstanding and needed?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we have an active Blue Highways facility actually in Hunts Point on a privately owned site. So ConAg had announced their partnership with EDC in barging in concrete material by barge rather than by truck. So we expect that could reduce truck trips by about 1,000 per month. So they have a temporary operation with plans to make that more permanent over time. The next Blue Highways landing that we expect to become online is the downtown Skyport, formerly known as the downtown Manhattan Heliport. So again, another partnership between EDC and a private operator that we're very excited about because we're really making the most of this facility in Lower Manhattan for it to be not only a vertiport to support electric helicopter technology, but also to become a Blue Highways landing. We expect that it will be different than the ConAg facility in Hunts Point in that downtown Skyport. Given that it's relatively small in size, we'll likely be moving what we call micro freight. So for example, food from the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center could be transported either by barge or even by fast ferry from Hunts Point to Lower Manhattan to supply a lot of the restaurants that are in Lower Manhattan. And then there's a number of other sites, including the Brooklyn Marine Terminal, but also we would be looking at potentially the Manhattan Cruise Terminal as being another opportunity as we start planning for its modernization to potentially integrate Blue Highway capacity there in response to industry interest in that location or another location near Midtown Manhattan for reducing truck trips and bringing more freight by water.
Okay, great. And funding secured versus what's needed?
I'll have to confirm the amount of funding that we've committed in terms of city capital, but I, can highlight that for the Brooklyn Marine Terminal, we have a $164 million US DOT grant to convert the existing finger piers into a marginal pier. Part of that is creating a flex terminal to support Blue Highways activity and BMT becoming a major node in this citywide network. That's leveraging almost $10 million in city capital as well. And I know that some city capital, I think, is being pledged to downtown Skyport. And then I'm remembering that you had asked about the Hunts Point Marine Terminal on the city-owned site. We're making progress there, having recently released an RFP for the scrapping of the prison barge. So that's the first move that is underway. And then continuing to plan for the infrastructure that can support Blue Highway of freight to be received there.
Great, thank you. The law required detailed analysis and recommendations for different parts of the city, not just citywide strategies. Where are the specific neighborhood level recommendations for areas like Sunset Park, Hunts Point, and North Brooklyn?
Yeah, we're certainly planning to roll out additional detail and information at the town halls that we thought that would allow us for a more borough specific look into. Rather than the document already quite long at 100 pages, we wanted to focus at the sort of policy levels, but we think that there's an opportunity as we get into borough meetings to go a little bit deeper and, of course, into the final plan to continue to have more appendices and information. That being said, we do have a lot more data and information than we've already put forward. And so certainly welcome Councilmember you or others who are, have specific questions about recommendations and how they pertain to each individual area, that we'll be having that conversation in bespoke ways through the engagement process.
That's great. And then so we should expect that the final plan will include the geographic areas.
Yes.
Okay. And then just my last question, we obviously want to make this plan as the best plan as possible. What do you need from the council to deliver what the law requires? If you could have a magic wand and just...
Unlimited time and resources, is that a good answer?
No,
I would say, Councilmember, we really want your your partnership and in helping make as many New Yorkers aware of the process and as engaged in the process as possible. We know that this is a huge issue for the future of the city, and I think it's one that can be a little bit overlooked by certain constituencies. If you're not somebody, if you live in an industrial area, or you live near an industrial area, you work in an industrial area, you are highly attuned to this issue. But many other New Yorkers may not know how this affects them, or why industry is so important to the future of the city. So I think the best that we could all do together is really engaging as many New Yorkers in this process as we can in the months that we have left. And we would absolutely welcome your and all council members' partnership in reaching that wide audience.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to yield at the moment and recognize members for their questions. I'd like to first call on Councilmember Gutierrez, followed by Aviles.
Thank you so much, Majority Leader, and thank you, DCP. Before I get to my questions, I do want to acknowledge that, this is it's a lengthy draft plan, and I know that you all were very genuine in your efforts to do outreach, and I just want to thank you. I know that you made sure the surveys were in multiple languages, and I just want to acknowledge that because I know that you don't have an infinite amount of time and resources, so thank you. I do have some concerns, and again, I know that this is a draft plan, so I hope that you record all of these questions and concerns into your next step. But I am concerned that the draft plan as written could accelerate speculation, and I'm basing this off of the presentation today and what I was able to read. In the summary and just the maps that you have in the draft plan, I'm really concerned that with no financial tools being recommended, that we're putting vulnerable businesses at risk. My first set of concerns is around the new framework, and I know that I expressed this to you before. I feel like they're not clearly defined. I need to understand how you got here, how you got to this primary and secondary industrial areas, how the mapping was considered. And I just, considering the district that I represent, North Brooklyn, Bushwick, Williamsburg, and Ridgewood, I'm concerned about speculation. I'm concerned about residential. I'm concerned about housing. The previous versions that we've seen, including the response to the North Brooklyn industrial study, I think that there was a lot of effort by DCP to create new framework, kind of every iteration. It was a very cagey, this is the transition and this is the core and this is and so now we're here in primary and secondary. That's fine. It sounds like you've tried to narrow it down to less so that there's, less subzones. But I'm concerned how you got here. I would love to know if you can share any of that. I'm concerned for what I'm seeing on the Ridgewood side, and I'm not sure if the map in the plan, obviously there's no street name, so it's hard for me to tell what's there, but would love to know what's going on in Ridgewood. If there was an elimination of the industrial zone in Ridgewood, I need to know how you all got here. So I'll start there. If you could just share with me.
Sure.
That.
Let me start first on a big plug, and to those watching at home, that the maps are all online and in an interactive form where you can zoom into the street and block level, nyc.gov/industrial plan. Councilmember, we'd of course be happy to spend some time walking at a more detailed level through your district and talking about all of the changes. We were guided in the methodology laid out in the legislation in how we tried to make these maps. So the legislation told us first to look at the predominance of industry in different areas of the city. We used land use data through Pluto, the city's land use classification system, to pull out where there were the levels of industrial predominance on a block by block basis. We also looked at the economic data and employment data that we're able to access through contract with New York State Department of Labor, tried to look at where there were clusters of industry present, where how industry was changing in different areas. And then we looked at, really importantly, infrastructure access. So we mapped highway ramps, we mapped marine access, we mapped rail access, and we tried to think about, we mapped truck routes, both existing and in conversation with DOT through their truck route redesign process. And we tried to understand what areas of the city, were really not just conducive, had clusters of industry, were conducive to continue, but also have the infrastructure to continue that intensification of industrial activity. Areas like Ridgewood did not fare well in that particular because of both an erosion of industrial activity over time, but also the local street network and being so isolated in many of the conditions from the highway ramps that are connecting it. And so there were a few areas of the city that we did not designate because of the that lack of truck access in and out of them, and the juxtaposition that's creating between industry and high truck traffic and existing residential communities. So those are some of the reasons that our maps are the way they are. But again, we really recognize that this is the beginning of a process where we're bringing out a draft that reflects an agency perspective and methodology for public conversation.
Thank you. So I understand that. And again, I understand that this is a draft plan, but Ridgewood, 2 years ago, New York Times reported the most rapid loss of rent stabilized apartments were in Ridgewood, right? And so you are considering this for essentially the removal of the Ridgewood IBZ. The housing that is going to be proposed there is not going to be for those people that have been displaced, because precisely we are not talking about preserving manufacturing. I am very, very fearful and very, very much opposed to this proposal. I understand that this is the guide that you use, but I need you all to take a step back as DCP and understand the various factors that also affect that neighborhood. So unfortunately, there's, the Ridgewood manufacturing zone is in a complicated location, again, using the rubric that you just shared. But I am very concerned about just the complete kind of walking away from this zone and the impact that could have for the neighborhood of Ridgewood, the residents and the businesses. I really implore for you all to kind of look at multiple factors there, because it is a smaller zone. It's not like some of the other areas in the city, but I have all my flags are raised there. I have a couple more questions. Sorry, let me just pull it up. And I think the majority leader may have asked this, but I'm still unclear on the response. How do you all propose the marrying of what was achieved in the various tax amendments to the City of Yes and kind of what you're proposing? The City of Yes obviously very explicitly was not mapping. This is that, but just how do you see that marriage, particularly some of the last amendments that really, I think, emphasized what was permissible in heavy manufacturing and what was not, versus what we're seeing here in your proposal?
I'm not 100% sure I understand the last point that you made, Councilmember, but let me try to answer and tell me if I'm covering your question. We created, through City of Yes for Economic Opportunity, 3 new types of zones: the M1A, the M2A, and the M3A, at a variety of different densities and scales. Those 3 districts have now been piloted in 3 rezonings: Midtown South, which was just passed by the council, Jamaica, and Long Island City, which are in front of the council. So those are the first times where we've used, and actually all 3 designations have been deployed. Jamaica represents the first use of the M2A and M3 designations in the city. So we're excited about that. We think that those districts are really helpful to unlocking different kinds of industrial development. It's our hope to use them in the future. We've indicated in the framework that we think that they generally ascribe to the designation of the different levels, namely that we think M3A is an appropriate zoning tool for the primary areas, and we think the M2A is an appropriate tool for the secondary areas. We have not said block for block that is the necessary zoning outcome the plan is a framework, and it's not a zoning plan itself. And while I think we're sensitive of the tension of putting forward a citywide plan that necessarily assumes the correct zoning outcomes for an individual given neighborhood. Actually, I think the comments you made about Ridgewood, which we take very seriously, are a really good example of that, right? That it's really important. While I think the idea of a citywide framework that helps us understand prioritization is really strong and useful and important in industry where there's been a concern about a incremental change in policy, that it's also really important when we're making actual decisions about what zone to change to on the ground to be in consultation with local stakeholders, right? It's very difficult to do that fully at a citywide scale. So while we're interested in thinking about future implementation that might mean mapping some of those tools in a lot of different neighborhoods, we can certainly see the need for them in a lot of different neighborhoods. We don't yet today, at the stage of a draft plan, have an implementation strategy for how we would deploy those on a citywide basis, on a multiple neighborhood basis, and how to achieve that. And of course, if we're talking about ULURP actions, the council's partnership in making those determinations is extremely important.
Yeah, for now, that's right. Thanks. Can I ask what other neighborhoods in the mapping were you did you come to the same conclusion as Ridgewood, like based on these guidelines? We would essentially be removing this industrial area.
I want to push back on the language of that we're removing any industrial area. That's certainly not what we think the proposals are. But I think the question you're asking is: are there key areas where we have not designated a primary or a secondary industrial district? I would name Greenpoint Williamsburg as another area where there is a cluster of.
So, and I'm
industry.
sorry to interrupt you, but just so that I'm clear, in your maps, IBZs were not removed.
We have not removed any.
That's right. In the draft,
IBZ.
This is obviously this is a draft plan,
Yes.
But even in the online tool that you have.
Yes, just to be clear, because I want to be nuanced on this point. We haven't recommended the removal of any IBZs. IBZs are a tax benefit. We think that it's a tax benefit that could potentially be improved, but we have not recommended a specific change to those boundaries. Insofar as we are recommending a new kind of land use policy, we have recommended differences in that land use policy than the commitment to not considering residential in the IBZ tax zones represented. So I think in effect what you mean, right, we are recommending a different strategy for approaching where residential might or might not be appropriate, but it is not, technically speaking, a change to the tax policy of IBZs. We have not recommended a change to that boundary map.
So what? I appreciate you, but you are over talking this a little bit, and so I'm just not clear. So what were we just talking about Ridgewood? So just so that I'm clear.
Ridgewood is not a designated industrial area in this plan.
Okay. And so what other neighborhoods in the city are facing the same suggestion or recommendation that you've made in this proposal?
Right.
You said parts of Greenpoint.
Yes, so there are areas of Greenpoint Williamsburg, for instance, in the council members' district, that are today in an IBZ tax zone, but are not designated as an industrial area in this plan, for instance.
Okay, so I guess I just want to understand, since the intent of the bill was obviously to do this study, make recommendations, ultimately with the intent of supporting and growing manufacturing. Where is the trade-off? Where were the recommendations that we can see where these suggestions live for Greenpoint and Ridgewood, but live somewhere else?
Well, again, Councilmember, I'm glad you asked the question, because I think the flip side of this is that we haven't talked about areas which are not currently covered by an IBZ tax policy, but are designated as primary and secondary industrial areas. And again, just stepping back, we did not, the methodology of these maps was not directly informed by the IBZ map itself. I suspect 20 years ago when the IBZ map was made that the inputs were quite similar, looking at the predominance of industry in the city, the economic patterns going on within industry. But we found many areas that were actually quite industrial and deserved designation that had not been covered. And as I mentioned earlier in my testimony, the overall acreage covered by primary and secondary areas is actually larger than the area covered by the tax plan. So some of those geographies include College Point, parts of Western Staten Island, components of the Eastchester industrial cluster, and a whole variety of others. So we really looked, again, with fresh eyes, 20 years on from an attempt to craft a land use policy, and tried to identify, again, those areas that had the predominance of industrial character and the infrastructure to support it. So those, we did not, in many ways, substantially, the geographies overlapped because we were approaching very similar exercises, but with differences in methodology and 20 years of change, we did come to some different conclusions.
Do you have a sense of what the amount of job loss we would be looking at versus jobs gained in some of these newer areas?
I'd be reluctant to put a number to it, but I think conceptually we think that job growth will be encouraged by any place that we can intensify the development of new job-creating spaces. And insofar as we pointed out that most of our industrial areas of the city today have not been gaining a considerable amount of jobs, have not seen significant economic development, we think the key is really finding ways to create new investment opportunities in areas that haven't seen it. So we would anticipate that anywhere where we make those changes, we would be looking at job increases.
All right. Have you been able to do an analysis on the property value increases both in and around the areas losing protections to become more housing and mixed use?
No, we have not done any analysis of property values, and I want to stress again today, the plan is not making a specific recommendation about the introduction of additional uses. It's making a recommendation about the prioritization of industry. So it would be, I'm not sure what the basis of such a study would be, but in any case, we have not done any property value analysis.
Okay. I have more questions, but I will pass it to the chair because I know everybody else has questions. Thank you.
Just going to acknowledge you've also been joined by Councilmember Ressler, and I'd like to recognize Councilmember Aviles.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of today is just a day of abundance for me. In terms of the industrial sector, you note that there seems to be an increase in the geography, but just today, through the BMT, we're losing 60 acres of industrial manufacturing property. How does that math shake out?
Councilmember, thank you for the question, and it's good to see you. As I mentioned, there are a number of geographies that were not covered by the original IBZ tax policy that we have recommended for primary or secondary designation. Those include, amongst places, but in very large acreage, College Point, as well as considerable land on the western side of Staten Island.
But in terms of this particular property, there's a full reduction. Can I ask you, I'm not going to belabor this. Can I ask you, in terms of one of the things you noted, a big challenge for industrial businesses is rent, right? Is a 25% discount on market an attractive and sufficient incentive to actually bring in industrial manufacturing business? Like even on current terms.
Councilmember,
Just as a matter of practice, would, let's say market rate, if you offer a 25% discount on a market rate, do you think that would be sufficient to attract industrial business at the scale that we are trying to do here in this city as a policy matter?
Councilmember, it sounds like there are specifics behind what you're asking that I'm not as familiar with. Certainly, I would imagine that in any circumstance where I think government action is able to defray the cost of occupying space, that will help many businesses.
Okay, well, I'll answer the question because I think you know that industrial businesses require much deeper subsidy because the market rates are so astronomical, and is one of our challenges in our industrial business zones. In order to protect and strengthen them, I think what I'm merely pointing out, which is not necessarily in your bailiwick, but certainly in EDC's bailiwick, that they think that's an actual incentive to economic industrial business growth, when we know that's in fact the case not. Let me switch it over to, as noted by DCP, our IBZs are often ecosystems with one manufacturer sometimes supplying something of a need of another, or even supporting an overall policy goal for the city. I'm curious of whether DCP has given any nuanced consideration to specific districts. I think you said some of that is going to come out later. But particularly focusing on my district, has DCP considered Uprose's 2.0 grid plan, which contemplates just transition to a green economy within the industrial business zone and the SMIAs in Sunset?
Yes, we've certainly taken a look at it. It was brought to our attention during the outreach process. We've met with a number of environmental justice stakeholders, and it certainly did inform us.
Can you break that down a little bit more clearly? What were the considerations that we could see materializing in any part of this plan at this point?
Well, certainly I would say with regards to Sunset Park in general, the plan does make recommendations for primary and secondary industrial designations throughout much of the Sunset Park area. I think our data shows that Sunset Park today is one of the most important industrial clusters in the city. It is one of the areas where we have seen industrial growth. It has some of the best infrastructure from a rail, marine, and highway perspective, accessing some of the industrial areas. It's seen significant investment from EDC and city assets along the industrial core of Sunset Park. And so it is one of the areas where we anticipated that there is a likely future potential for significant industrial infrastructure and growth in the future, and the plan's recommendations, to the extent that they are local, do reflect that.
So, I'm sorry. Recommendations from the Grid 2.0, are we likely to see DCP actually proceed with any of those recommendations in concrete terms? Creating a special district to ensure that we are going to use that property for just transition as opposed to building schools in industrial zones, which is something we have started to see on the west side of 3rd Avenue, which is a true problem.
I think, Councilmember, we'd have to get into more details with you. I can't recall. We certainly did not lift directly recommendations from the grid plan into here, to the extent that it is equally concerned with the potential for green job creation, that it is considering the juxtaposition of different kinds of uses, as you mentioned, schools and industrial zones. Those are things that we are making recommendations on, and I would say, at least philosophically, quite aligned.
Okay.
If I could jump in just for a moment to
please.
talk to about really like climate threats, and the environmental question has been
let's
so
talk about
central
that.
to the development of this plan. So, we came to this from this very pro-industrial perspective, but as we spoke to more like environmental justice advocates, we heard a lot more about, hey, we have issues with asthma and public health, and you guys have totally overlooked this. You guys really have to think more about, what is the impact of heat and flooding and pollution in these neighborhoods. So that was really the impetus to creating, an additional and central focus to this plan, which is talking about how do we both support industrial, but how do we also encourage the greening of these areas? And I think there are ways in which DCP has the ability to act, but we are also working very closely with MOCJ to make sure that we're aligned with their initiatives. But a big thing is thinking about how do we make these areas, say, more porous when there's stormwater flooding events? How do we make these areas greener? Certainly on congestion in trucks. I mean, truck safety is a huge issue in your district, particularly 3rd Avenue, where, we have these freight movements and these businesses need to get their deliveries. But how do we make it such that people can actually live in the neighborhood and walk to that IBZ or to the industrial district, and not be afraid walking under the BQE? I mean, we've been to that industrial district many times, and it's always stressful to walk under either the BQE or we're up in Port Morris, the Bruckner's stressful to walk under. So those are things that we're also taking into consideration. But as you can imagine, it's challenging to say, we're going to prioritize environmental issues and we're going to prioritize industrial intensification, because sometimes they're not inherently at odds, but aligning those things can be really challenging. And we've heard that a lot too about local law 97 compliance, right? Everybody supports that perspective and that initiative. We want to decarbonize, we want to be green. How do you smelt metal without gas? There's these difficult questions for us to navigate.
No, I appreciate that. And you can certainly attract and incentivize green business and locally owned green businesses at that, in addition to a whole host of other things which our community has been asking for a very long time. I mean, in terms of those, the threats around climate change, permeable surfaces don't work in all of Red Hook, so that's not even an option. I only heard 3, actually. Could you remind me the 3 you highlighted? It was permeable surfaces, bioswales, and what was the other treatment that was noted?
Well, planting more trees. I mean, right now
Planting more trees.
we don't require that in our M zones, but it is one of our recommendations to consider how do we both either require that in new developments or new redevelopment, or how do we, as a city, start prioritizing plantings?
Are there any other treatments that you're considering to address climate change in these areas?
Well, we don't have specific instances of it, but we also do talk about just further hardening, supporting initiatives where we say harden the waterfront. So really like working on a more like waterfront protections, but we don't have specific instances of that.
Can I ask, when you say harden, what do you mean? Because I hear something that is very anti-addressing climate change when I hear harden.
Well, there are
waterfront.
certain
So
movements,
you might
obviously,
mean something
have
different.
gray infrastructure interventions in public space, right? Like the Red Hook coastal protections are an example. In some cases of a gray improvement versus a green improvement, right? So they're, but I think also equally important when we're talking about climate resilience for industrial businesses. Many of them have open components. Many of them are reliant on ground floors, which makes the climate vulnerability pretty challenging. So a lot of resilience involves elevating your electricals, finding operational strategies for moving your fleet or your components off-site to a flood-proofed area, or elevating in an issue of flood. Right, there's a lot of operational challenges associated with an industry that is, operating and must operate in the floodplain. So some of that is capital investment, some of that is ongoing operational investment. We have done things in past zoning to help businesses elevate when they can, but again, that requires reinvestment in a site. We think there are other things that can be done regulatorily to make it easier for businesses to do it, but it's also a resource constraint, right? So things like the development fund, things like funding from DEP for upgrades, all of these factor in, I think, when we're talking about, somebody who's just trying to figure out, I've got a wire repair business, and I've got spools, that I'm moving in and out, and, where are the spools supposed to go when the flood rains come, right? I mean, that those can just be significant expenses. And so I think approaching that from the how do we allow for businesses to elevate and make their operational plans, but also how do we get them the resources they need, are things that are woven into multiple parts of the plan here.
So for MX districts, can you talk about some of the additional environmental rules that industrial businesses might face when co-locating with residential?
Yeah, it's a great question. So right now, under our zoning, we allow for the co-location of an industrial business with a residential business, but you are subject to state DEC tiering requirements. So only certain types of business emissions profiles would be allowed through the program, as well as certain hazardous materials. If you're working with certain kinds of chemicals or certain kinds of solvents, those activities preclude you from the co-location within a vertical building. And those rules were written to protect safety. But we found that in practice, and a great example I will give of this is 803 Rockaway, the bridge project done by Greenpoint Manufacturing Design Council, and opened earlier this year as the city's first 100% affordable building with manufacturing space at its base. In order to put woodworking type uses that involve a spray booth and other kinds of emittance, even though they're able to design the building in a way that safely controls that kind of environmental profile, the way that our regulations work right now, they actually needed special dispensations in order to be able to achieve the building. And so we have a recommendation in the plan that's really looking at that sort of testing more that environmental feasibility of putting additional kinds of industrial uses, because we think more types of entities like a GMDC or a fully private market rate developer may experiment more with a wider range of industrial uses that have been shown precedentially to be able to be made safe in a contained context, but which our rules are currently precluding. So that might be anything from woodworking to a coffee roaster, to certain kinds of artists or fabrications, right? Really, the controls right now are very generic and specifically working on a sort of outdated mentality of emissions and hazard standards that may be good in a lot of cases, but when we're trying to achieve that ability to co-locate industry with residential in ways that can be made safe, but through idiosyncratic environmental protections, our rules don't currently allow for.
So for sites where a GPP process might be imposed on mixed industrial and residential development, how is the city going to ensure similar protections for its residents?
So using the example of the Brooklyn Marine Terminal, where we have made a commitment to creating light industrial space as a part of mixed-use residential buildings in BMT North, we would be working closely with DEP to make sure that the kinds of light industrial uses that we will be including in future development RFPs are in fact uses that would not create conditions that are hazardous to future residents in those mixed-use buildings.
But I would echo again that I think what we've seen is that there are these examples now where it really provides an opportunity to leverage the creation of a residential space to create new industrial space. I think this new building that I mentioned, 803 Rockaway, is a fantastic model. We understand that GMDC is interested in looking at that model in other locations in the city. We hope that many others will take that model and expand it. It's not a panacea for the creation of new industrial space, but it can deliver us small scale manufacturing spaces in places that need it. And in conditions that really work. I think they've really shown that woodworking and residential can live cheek to jowl if you put in the kinds of protections like vapor barriers and ventings that make that ensure the protection of the residents and nearby users from any potential hazard.
While transportation and logistics might comprise a majority of growth in our IBCs, I'm curious if DCP has collected any data around how particular facilities impact the cost of impact the cost of square foot to lease or purchase industrial space?
I think what you're asking, council member, is does the introduction of new users increase the cost for other users? And I would say absolutely. I think what we've seen, and in many ways, this is no different than our housing challenges as a city. When you have a very scarce supply and increased competition, prices go up. And there are areas of the city where our industrial space is in high demand, and we're not creating enough more of it. And in part, that's because our zoning doesn't even allow you to create more space. And I think our markets are constrained. And I think prices have reflected that increase in some locations.
So do you think that'll continue to constrain incentivization, or?
I think our job as a planning entity is to really try to make space for everyone. And I think that's what we really want to focus on is the ability of the city to really unlock new opportunities for industrial users, but for all users. We think that scarcity is a primary driver of the challenges of affordability in this space.
I'm going to yield back my time and then come back because I have too many questions.
Thank you, Councilmember. I'm now going to recognize Councilmember Ressler for questions.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I just want to, thank my three colleagues who are here today, who have really been, I think, doing an exceptional job advocating for smart industrial policy and looking to protect industrial areas. And through your leadership on City of Yes and beyond, I'm really grateful. And as I often say to Councilmember Gutierrez, when it comes to this work, I am just happy that she's taking the lead and that I can support her. And she does a terrific job advocating for the industrial communities in North Brooklyn, and I'm really grateful for it. A few questions. I don't have as many as my colleagues, but just broad strokes. Through City of Yes, we had an agreement for this planning process. So could you talk me through the timeline for best case scenario? Let's just say, I know we don't know who the mayor's, we don't officially know that Zoran's going to be the mayor yet in 3 months. Is that the right way to say it? I knocked on wood, don't worry. But best case scenario from your all's perspective, what's the timing on the steps to go from planning process to ULURP actions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll buy myself a moment by congratulating you on a new dais that is wood that you can knock on.
At least it seems like wood. I don't know.
Look, I think as I mentioned, I'm not sure if you were in the room, council members, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but I think it's very clear. The draft plan is certainly not an implementation plan. It's a policy document and a guide. We certainly have hopes in here, and I think we've identified many opportunities where zoning changes could help unlock investment in areas that are generally suffering under bad old zoning for a variety of different potential outcomes, right? We think there are places where rezoning could achieve additional industrial protection. We think there are places where it could unlock additional job creation. We think there are potentially places where it could unlock housing creation, where we have perhaps been too conservative in the past about areas that we've considered off limits. All of those.
But I do want to pin you down more. So we're in a planning process right now. You've got some dates in here that you're doing some community meetings. Appreciate you coming to NYU in Brooklyn. Those planning meetings are happening through the fall. You're soliciting feedback on this plan. Talk me through discreetly the next steps and the approximate timelines associated for, in a best case scenario, when you would look to begin a ULURP process.
Yeah, I think
broad strokes.
The first thing is that this plan is including a framework for how we think about that prioritization of preservation, right? So we believe this is a draft. The final plan delivered by the end of the year under the required legislation should include a final map that reflects a perspective on the prioritization of the different areas. We don't believe we would be initiating any rezonings in 2025, but best case scenario, we would hope that in 2026, some of the ideas and opportunities that are identified from the plan can begin their advancement into some form of rezoning in a 2026 agenda. It's certainly something that we'd be looking for to unlock, at DCP. There were some questions earlier, I think, about how we approach that from a sort of neighborhood by neighborhood versus a citywide perspective, considering that this plan is itself citywide. We don't have a good answer to how that should function, except setting aside that we think it's really important, of course, to be working on any neighborhood change with the neighborhoods that are affected, even if there are multiple neighborhoods affected. But if you're talking about a rezoning that was initiated based on ideas that are represented in the plan and sometime in 2026, that's probably, typically our rezonings that are in process right now have been a 2-year or so process. So I would imagine, a similar timeline for a future action of that scale.
So we're
Could be a few
planning
more,
through-
right? Several years.
We're planning through the end of the year, and then potentially a 2-year process to work toward certification for what could be a individual neighborhood or neighborhoods, or could be a citywide approach.
Yeah,
Is that the
some
right-
combination of the two. We think that there are multiple recommendations in here that also speak to text amendments versus straight mapping type actions. For instance, as we were just describing, anything where you were changing requirements for planting in an industrial area is probably text versus a mapping. But yeah, generally,
And
I would
none
say
of
2
this-
years is a good rule of thumb.
None of this would be subject to the appeals board, because the appeals board only does housing. Is that right?
I'm not as up to speed on the particulars, but I think that that's correct. We could
Just
certainly
wondering
look
if
at that
we're
question.
relevant for the conversation
Yeah.
or not. So,
It hasn't come up in any prior conversation that I've been in for what
I
that's
mean,
worth.
I'm making light, but I'm not really. So, okay. You did mention some of the industrial areas in District 33, and mentioning, so when we talk about kind of some of the areas you mentioned are currently IBZs, and I think what you described is a shift to just M zones and they'd no longer be IBZs. Is that what you're envisioning for those areas? Could you speak a little bit more to kind of the Greenpoint, Williamsburg, Northside IBZ area when you're talking about maybe a lifting of some restrictions? Could you be as specific as possible in the changes that you're envisioning?
I don't suppose we could bring maps back up. That's probably a little complicated. So we're happy to follow up and show you the maps that were in the presentation, or
I have
they may
them all
be in
here.
front of you.
I have them all.
Somebody want to just say what page the framework map is on?
I mean, yeah. This is the new industrial land use framework?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I'm
So
here.
a bit tiny.
Councilmember Gutierrez already
nyc.gov/industrial
pointed out the
plan
right
will allow you to
pages for me
zoom
to
in. So as we described, what the plan includes is a framework between primary industrial areas, secondary industrial areas, and then other M areas that are not designated but obviously remain in M zoning. Where we've
But no
identified.
plan at this time to convert these areas that are currently IBZs into housing.
No. What we have is a policy document that is designating some areas as really intended for the exclusive use of it of industry, as distinctly non-residential as an effort to preserve industry, or undesignated, and therefore we think that industry and industrial policy is somewhat irrelevant to the outcomes of that area. They remain M. We have not proposed a specific rezoning. So Greenpoint Williamsburg is an example of one of those areas that was not designated. It was not designated based on what we see today of the remaining cluster of industrial jobs and industrial land use in the area, as well as a somewhat unique lack of access to transportation, and particularly to highway ramps through residential areas. And so it did not meet the criteria that we had identified for the primary or secondary areas. So that means that we are not taking a position within this plan right now. as to what its future should be, we are saying that it is not a priority area from an industrial policy perspective.
Okay. And when Councilmember Gutierrez and others worked on the North Brooklyn Industrial Plan, is that Industrial and Innovation Plan? Is that what we called it? Industrial Plan. Okay,
Yeah.
North Brooklyn Industrial Plan. Leah can remind us all the facts. The idea then was kind of similar in the idea of let's have some core industrial areas that were really strengthening protections and putting the most critical industrial uses in those places, and in areas that are kind of more integrated into residential communities and other places we might think about lighter industrial uses or innovation uses, or even, I mean, a variety of other things. I'm sure Mayor Adams would like to just put a lot of music venues in those places. But yeah, just about. So could you speak to how your framework differs from that plan that Councilmember Gutierrez and Borough President Reynoso and others worked on over the years?
I think that plan actually it absolutely provides, in many ways, the genesis for this thinking of the sort of three-part, which I will just, reductively, the way I think of it is sort of preserve, encourage, accommodate sort of structure. North Brooklyn did a lot of work on this. North Brooklyn, of course, never fully came to fruition, and so how that would relate to zoning tools was never fully determined. So we're in an advantaged position now that we have actual zoning tools. So the M3A tool, for instance, the core tool, is actually more, I think, aggressive than any of the sort of work that was ultimately developed in North Brooklyn, at least as I understand it, insofar as it excludes all non-industrial uses under 10,000 square feet. I think there was never quite as radical an approach at that time than the M3A represents. The M2A also went through a lot of refinement, really to get to a tool. It's a little bit more informed also by Gowanus Mix, and by other efforts to think about how we can incentivize on an as-of-right and more neighborhood basis. So it benefited from multiple Brooklyn-born zoning attempts. But that same just sort of general framework, very applicable. The geographies are similar, not identical. And again, that process went through a lot of different map iterations. So depending on which we're comparing to, but I think, at a fundamental level, pretty a similar effort to think about those where we identify core, where we identify a sort of transitional zone, and where we open up opportunity for other uses. I think one new element that's quite relevant here, and again, we haven't taken a position on in the other areas whether residential is or is not appropriate, but certainly the commercial market in this area has changed since the time of the North Brooklyn studies, with the potential right now, at least, of higher density vertical office development being significantly less than it was at the nadir, I think, 2019.
Although, Domino is filling up. I think it's 70% full at this
That's true.
point.
That's true.
Some counterexamples.
Flight to quality, maybe opportunities. But I think we've been on a bit of a hitus of that development in this area.
I generally agree with your assessment. Unfortunately, I think it's the assessment for the office market across all of Brooklyn at this point. How do you balance the concerns about speculation and I think us all wanting to ensure that these industrial areas remain affordable, dynamic, vital industrial spaces with kind of recognition that especially in some of these areas that you're talking about other M zones, and I think you're being a little gray about what could potentially happen in those areas, maybe by design, like thinking about potential other uses in those places. Like, how do we avoid a speculative market while going through a planning process and considering alternative uses to areas where things have been quite restricted?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will say, yes, by design, I think we are not taking a position on the future potential zoning outcome of any
I wasn't being
individual
critical.
area.
I was just saying it
Right.
plainly.
I think we're being very particular about, right, like this plan is asking us to take a perspective on industrial policy and how we prioritize that. And so that's what we're doing. By subtraction, that may open up opportunities that deserve their own consideration, but may have other inputs that are also worthy. And it's not, I think, germane to the exercise we've been asked to do here to sort of, work through all of those opportunities.
How do we go through this exercise and not generate a bunch of bad speculation?
Well, I guess what I would say is, to the extent that we're identifying areas for future opportunity, right? And some of those may be places where the opportunity has changed because of the opening of industrial territory. That suggests to me an area that may be ripe for a rezoning study. That is typically how we've approached approached looking at an area more comprehensively. And certainly in a place like the first Greenpoint Williamsburg rezonings, where I recall similar concerns being raised about the the market changing and incremental change sort of moving before the public sector could holistically contemplate a more cohesive vision. That is exactly why and when the city moved in. And I think that's really been our modus operandi for most of our neighborhood studies, is really when we see that moment of opportunity and a need and a potential, is to get in front of it and to try and do the planning from the public sector side. So it sounds to me like that's like describing the opportunity for a city study. That to me feels like the most useful and tried response to that kind of condition.
Okay. I think it's just we kind of put ourselves in an impossible situation where we recognize that the neighborhood is changing. We recognize that we need to do some meaningful community engagement and think about the application of these new zoning tools that you're developing. And that's a multi-year process that allows, for I think potentially really harmful speculation to happen across a community. So I don't have the insights of how we stop that, but I do think it undermines the goals that we may be trying to achieve over the course of the plan. Last question for me, and I really just want to thank the chair for being so gracious. The IBIA tool. We get a lot of applications, or we get a good number of applications for these. You mentioned the softening of the Brooklyn office market, especially in North Brooklyn. Wanted to just ask the question: do you think about the enhancing or reducing the applicability of IBIA in this plan? And if you have any further thoughts on it, I'd just be interested.
Yeah, we haven't made any specific recommendations about the IBIA. We did talk about it a little bit as in the toolkit of existing tools. As you know, council member, there is an application for an IBIA currently in ULURP at 20 Berry. I think, and we anticipate as that project goes through also to take a little bit more of a look at the IBIA and the current status. It's my general understanding that there are a number of IBA projects that have worked. I think we're about to see Brooklyn Brewery move into its facility finally, and I think that's a great example of where these trade-offs can work really well. We've seen a long history of 25 Kent getting to full occupancy for a variety of reasons, some of which may or may not have to do with the IBIA itself.
Full occupancy? Because that would be news to me.
I don't think they are at full occupancy.
I don't either.
No. What I said, trying to achieve full occupancy.
Yeah, okay.
No, still not there as I understand it. A number of projects that have not moved forward under IBIA prior approvals, both in your district as well as on the Long Island City side. One of the primary challenges I think that has long been associated with the IBIA is the amount of process and bespoke approvals and reapprovals associated with the special permit process itself, that we may be controverting our desire to bonus the industrial space by making it harder to actually deliver than as of right space. That's something that we think the M2A zoning districts really do a better job of, which is why I mentioned, I think, learning a lot of lessons from Gowanus Mix which actually does seem to be, it's still early stages, but actually delivering some quite useful space on an as-of-right basis. So we think the M2A is potentially a more powerful, particularly neighborhood-wide tool, where you can map a generalizable incentive that's achievable as of right without every project having to go through an individual special permit process to try and achieve it. There may be projects, and 20 Berry is a great example of that, where the developer is choosing to seek the IBIA regardless, and there may be certain reasons why that's still more desirable. We don't know yet. We're still sort of looking at whether there are circumstances where the IBIA may be a more desirable outcome. The new M tools also do solve a lot of the bulk and loading challenges that the IBIA was also initially trying to solve. So we have some new tools that are available that we think make at least more sense in a sort of neighborhood situation. Whether there are remaining still reasons where the IBIA is a valuable policy device, even aside from those new ones, we don't know yet. But we have one example right now where a developer did choose it, or regardless.
I, as always, defer to Councilmember Gutierrez. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember. Just for a second round of questions, I have Councilmember Aviles.
Thought we were going to Gutierrez. Okay, I'm gonna submit a bunch of questions because I won't have time to go through them for the record, and would love to get the response from DCP. But I'll ask you just a few of them. In terms of the need for industrial space seems most acute for businesses requiring smaller footprints, as you cite in the report. How do you propose supporting the addition of more industrial spaces that fit those business needs for the ones that are under 5,000 square feet?
Yeah, I think that as I meant, the M2A and some of the creation of industrial space as parts of more mixed new development could be one really useful tool to this, right? So I mentioned 803 Rockaway earlier. I'll mention 25 Kent that Councilmember Ressler and I were just describing. I'll mention the Gowanus Mix projects. There are opportunities that we have where we are seeing new investment in the city because of the power of other product types like commercial or residential, where we think the creation of a single, condo or ground floor component that is industrial may help, right? That we can sort of leverage that investment opportunity to create small parcels. And we think that actually works best when we're talking about the delivery of smaller spaces, and when we're talking about industrial uses that aren't extremely truck or extremely environmentally intensive, right? So your small manufacturer, your wholesaler, your small construction office. These are all things that can occupy a pretty wide realm of different space typologies that we just need people to be able to deliver at a price that they can afford. And so figuring out how to help the market a little bit to encourage that kind of space to come online, we think could be quite helpful. We also should mention that City of Yes for Economic Opportunity made the largest change to industrial policy since 1961 at allowing for those kinds of businesses to occupy all of our commercial districts. And so the opportunity to take a vacant storefront space or a vacant office space is now available and really widens the geography of applicability for a lot of users. And we're only just now, I think, starting to see the tip of that opportunity. Again, it doesn't work for everyone. A lot of businesses are still going to be pinned to the ground floor, depending on what they are. But there's a lot of deals to be had in vacant office space right now.
Right.
And so being a little bit more creative, opening up that playing field as much as possible to deal with the scarcity issue is one of the ways that we're thinking about how to help those smaller
So
users.
in terms of the pricing and vacancy rates of real estate, that obviously vary greatly by geography, as you also cite in the report. Will you be able to disaggregate these statistics into smaller geographies?
The vacancy and typology, we're able to disaggregate them a little bit, but samples become an issue when we're looking at, for instance, IBZ by IBZ. But we're happy to talk to you about what we can and can't share.
Yeah, I'd definitely like to see it for our district, both Sunset Park and Red Hook in particular. In terms of the IB, you cite that the IBX corridor may need future land use changes to rezone currently industrial land. Given the significant importance of industrial jobs in Sunset Park, this also kind of strikes me as short-sighted. Historically, the IBZs protected vital industrial areas, such as this form of rezoning. How do we ensure that these commitments will be upheld?
I can speak to this because we worked pretty extensively with MTA on IBX, and obviously this is a big project of theirs, and we've thought a lot about this corridor and how do we balance like future needs based on versus what's there today. So I'd like to emphasize Brooklyn Army Terminal. That is something that in the draft we did call primary. And then we've actually expanded protections along this corridor. So as you know, really at like 60th Street corridor, Southern Borough Park, Southern Sunset Park, there's a whole viable little industrial district that runs along the IBX. So I've gone through there, walked it, and there's small production, there's actually textile, there's food production. So that's an area that we designated as secondary. We saw that as really kind of like this small niche industrial district that's playing this supportive role for housing construction or, restaurant operations in Sunset Park. So we codified protections there as secondary, and then we went up to Flatbush Flatlands, and then we looked at that IBZ specifically, and we really went block by block, and we designated most of that as secondary. But there are some blocks where there's large chain stores or vacant sites where we maybe did not designate secondary. But there's to the east of that area, it's called Flatlands, or the other part of the IBZ. Mm-hmm. We actually expanded secondary protections there as well because we've seen that part of the IBZ very highly viable. And then up in East New York, same thing, we designated that area as secondary. We visited that IBZ, and that actually has some viable freight rail frontage. So where we think like there's viable, active, ongoing industrial and where there are sites potentially to activate the freight rail, those are areas that we have codified as secondary. And we are intent on,
but secondary doesn't ensure full protections, or again, can you
secondary would not allow for residential rezoning. So
but it allows for what's the addition of secondary?
So we've kind of alluded to secondary as being appropriate for maybe like the M2A. So that's the area where you would incent industrial through this bonus in the FAR. But effectively, the rules would behave the same as they do now, right? So it would be an M district, and it would continue to be an area that allowed industrial and some commercial activity.
Would schools be allowed in M2As?
No.
Okay.
And I want to note, Councilmember, again, when John has mentioned expansion, particularly in that 65th Street corridor, we're talking about areas that are outside the IBZ today that have been entered into these new protections.
Okay, well, we'll look more closely. Since we just received this draft plan, there's a lot of in-depth review that needs to go. So we will certainly be meeting because there is a lot of concern with this plan so far. In terms of the Brooklyn meeting, it says NYU Brooklyn. What does that mean?
It's 370 J Street, and I believe we have the full addresses are on our website, nyc.gov/industrial plan. We can make sure you have all of the specific information. 6:30 p.m.
Obviously, I know you have a lot of ground to cover with the whole city, but one event in a borough is not sufficient community engagement around this, particularly because of the density of the materials. Mm-hmm. I would encourage a lot more, not just like passive send us your comments that go to a great person who reads all those comments, but really where there is real community engagement and discussion around what is being proposed to get the real live
Councilmember.
interaction.
The town halls are what was required under the legislation, but we'll absolutely be doing everything we can to go above and beyond, and we'd be happy to talk to you about those opportunities, including I do believe we've already reached out to your your community boards to offer more in-depth briefing.
Yeah, they're contending with a lot, and one is not going to be sufficient. So thank you. I look forward to seeing more being put on the calendar. You propose exploring changes to the BSA process to allow for schools within the M zones. What's the logic of making it easier to cite schools in industrial areas?
It's actually the opposite, and I think speaks to maybe what
okay.
you were contemplating, council member. We've heard a number of concerns about the juxtaposition of schools in industrial areas, and we think that there is potential to strengthen the existing BSA process. Schools are not allowed in the M2 and M3s today, but they are allowed by BSA special permit in the M1s. So that's specifically where we've made a recommendation about potentially targeting improvements.
I'm delighted to hear that. So we're going to remove that possibility of using the BSA process to cite schools, which has happened several times in
Well, I
in
don't
Sunset
think
Park.
that we can promise removal. It is a really difficult conversation. So we've already started some interagency, kind of a working group with BSA and School Construction Authority and DOT. So DOT obviously is very concerned about like child safety, accessibility. I mean, everybody is. It's not specifically them, but that's a concern. Of course, we have concern about, is this an appropriate use in these areas?
It's not what's difficult about it. We have safety issues persistent every day. We don't have crossing guards. We have DOT who can't address truck traffic. We have noxious facilities surrounding. What is difficult about this?
Well, I think, first of all, I just step back again. The draft plan is not making a recommendation on a full ban. It's making a recommendation to look at the provisions and see what can be done to strengthen it. That could be a whole range of things. And when we meet with you, we should talk about the specific circumstances. We have M1s all across the city in a variety of different conditions. So there may be places where it's very obvious that like this is not a good location for a school. And there are others where that may not be the case. So I think what we're looking at is to truly figure out what is the right policy to avoid the adverse outcomes that we're hearing about, but also make sure that we have a rational land use policy.
All right, look forward to more conversations. Lastly, what does it mean to not have current and significant IBZs identified as a primary or secondary industrial area in the draft plan?
Yeah, I think, Councilmember, this is to what we were speaking about before. The plan itself doesn't make a recommendation about the IBZ's like tax boundaries explicitly. It is making recommendations about where different kinds of uses are appropriate. In many ways, the geographies that we've identified are similar to the original IBZ boundaries, given that 20 years ago when we made IBZs, we were looking at a lot of the same features, like the predominance of industry and the accessibility of infrastructure in given areas. But in this planning process, and based on the methodology that the legislation helps outline, we've come to slightly different conclusions about where to designate primary and our most exclusive industrial areas, where to designate this secondary and think about job centers that are non-residential, and where we haven't made that designation. So those maps do not fully align with the IBZ maps. And there are areas, and we've spoken about a few of them earlier in Councilmember Gutierrez and Councilmember Ressler's district, where they are in an IBZ tax district. And historically, that has meant a commitment to not residential, but we have not designated them as part of this draft plan. We're not making a specific zoning recommendation in those areas. We're making a recommendation that they are not the priority industrial zones for this policy.
Well, okay, so I'll submit the rest of my questions, and we'll await a response. I'm very concerned by what we have before here and the fact that, from my perspective, the city continues to have these contradictory we're setting policies, exploring policies, and then in action actually undermining exactly what we are trying to do. And it is crazy making that we would say we're trying to protect and then give it away at the same time, or support the porous and the ability to deteriorate those zones, which have not been increasing. We have a lot of work to do on this, and I have a lot of concerns that there will be speculation, that we are putting our zones even more at risk here. The words feel pretty, but the action is saying a very different story. And so we will have some more conversations. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, members. Seeing no other questions, I'm going to excuse this panel. Thank you, folks, for joining us today. As you've already heard, we have a lot more future conversations to have and work to do together on getting to the final phase of this final initiative. So thank you so much. I'm now going to open the hearing for public testimony. I remind members of the public that this is a government proceeding and that decorum shall be observed at all times. As such, members of the public shall remain silent at all times. The witness table is reserved for people who wish to testify. No video recording or photography is allowed from the witness table. Further, members of the public may not present audio or video recordings as testimony, but may submit transcripts of such recordings to the Sergeant at Arms for inclusion in the hearing record. If you wish to speak at today's hearing and you have not already done so, please fill out an appearance card with the Sergeant at Arms and wait to be recognized. When recognized, you will have 2 minutes to speak on today's hearing topic of oversight of New York City Industrial Plan implementation progress. If you have a written statement or additional written testimony you wish to submit for the record, please provide a copy of that testimony to the Sergeant at Arms today. If you do not have it with you today, you may also email written testimony to testimony@council.nyc.gov within 72 hours of the close of this hearing. Audio and video recordings will not be accepted. For in-person panelists, please come up to the table once your name has been called. I will now call in our first panel: Leah Archibald, Christopher Walters, Quincy Elliott Cates, I'm sorry for that mispronunciation, and Charles Yu. You can begin when ready.
You want to start at the end or alphabetical?
You start.
I really would.
You want to start, Lynn?
I'll go alphabetical order. Hi, my name's Leah Archibald. I'm the executive director of Evergreen, and we're the local development corporation that works with businesses in industrial North Brooklyn to help them grow so that we can keep high-quality working-class jobs in our community. I want to thank you guys for all the work that you did, both in developing the IDAP legislation and hosting this hearing to talk about the draft plan. I would like to start my testimony, as I always do, putting in a plug for perhaps we could use a little extra help in the budget. And I know you guys have gone to bat for the industrial business service providers over and over again, but we can't do the work we do without support from the city. Even though it's a small component of funding of organizations like ours, it really helps us help a lot of businesses, plus, swing into action when things like the Industrial Action Plan get started. So we are hoping for an increase in funds. I'll give you the bullet points are all in my written testimony. I think it's more important that I spend the remaining minute I have talking about our concerns with the draft plan. I think you guys are right on with the concerns about speculation. Those little blurry, hard to decipher maps are sending a message to the market right now, right? And we saw this in Williamsburg in 2005. The biggest amount of business loss did not occur after that zoning was approved in 2005. It was the 2-year lead up to the rezoning where leases didn't get renewed and businesses moved out and people warehoused their space. That was that message to the market is key. And I guess you can read the rest of my points in the testimony, but we're really, let me close with, we're really concerned about a bunch of things. The fact that the entire Greenpoint Williamsburg Industrial Business Zone is not mapped, and the most job-rich section of your district, Councilwoman Gutierrez, where, Wonton Foods, 322 jobs, Boar's Head Foods, Bungalow Projects is putting in a massive new film studio. None of that is mapped for any protection. Not to mention 4 of the 5 buildings my organization owns that have 30-year restrictive decks on them to lease out to small manufacturers. So I want to thank you guys for your attention to this. I'm sorry that I went on, but as you all know, I could really go on and on and on about this subject at great length. So thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you.
Great. I guess I'll go next. Thank you, Majority Leader.
Press the microphone.
Is that on now? Great. Thank you, Majority Leader and Council members, for holding this hearing, offering the opportunity to share our initial thoughts on the NYC Industrial Plan. These will be along the same themes as you all raised and as Leah raised. My name is Chris Walters. I'm the Senior Land Use Policy Associate at the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, ANHD. As a key part of our work, ANHD convenes and participates in the Industrial Jobs Coalition, fighting to protect, preserve, and grow the industrial sector in NYC. ANHD supported the creation of the industrial plan because we believe in proactive, comprehensive planning to strengthen and grow the industrial sector. I want to say this fundamental goal is acknowledged in the first sentence of the draft report, which confirms the intention of the legislation was to develop a planning initiative to support the growth of the industrial sector. Our hope was that this plan could serve as a roadmap for future actions to achieve this goal, including through zoning changes to map the newly created core industrial zoning districts. This focus on zoning and land use is crucial, as one of the essential challenges that the industrial sector faces is limited and shrinking land in which it is able to operate. This is something that the report itself acknowledges. While there are numerous recommendations in the plan around policy, funding, and investments for the industrial sector, we want to stress that for them to be effective, we need to make sure we are preserving industrial zone land and limiting the possibility of too many competing uses. This is obviously particularly true within existing IBZs today. The draft land use framework raises concerns that this will not be a priority and that the city's future land use decisions will run counter to the goal of strengthening and growing the industrial sector. As you all have shared already, we have specific concerns as well that the report does not take a position on the preservation of existing IBZs and does not include more areas within them as primary industrial areas, while at the same time including so many areas as other M zones that may be considered for residential use under MX rezonings. As an initial and immediate next step, we believe it's important for DCP to clarify what percentage of existing M zone land it is proposing as primary, secondary, and other M zones, and to break that down within each existing IBZ. And I'll finish in just a moment, while also analyzing how their proposed framework will preserve, grow, or reduce industrial jobs if implemented. So I just want to close by saying we, ANHD, and the IJC, we look forward to working with you all and with DCP to arrive at a land use framework that we all feel better acknowledges and preserves existing industrial business hubs and the good paying jobs that they provide. Thanks very much.
Hello, good afternoon, Councilmember Farias and committee. My name is Quincy Ely-Kate. I'm Director of Industrial Business Development at the Business Outreach Center Bach Network. We proudly support industrial manufacturing businesses across Central Queens, East Brooklyn, and the Bronx, areas that span 11 industrial business zones, including East New York and Flatlands, Fairfield, and Brooklyn, Maspeth and Ridgewood IBZs in Queens, and the Hunts Point, Port Morris, and Zarega IBZs in the Bronx. Our work helps businesses expand by supporting procurement development, access to capital and financing, navigating incentives and government regulations, and recruitment and training. I also wanted to plug, which thank you for touching on earlier, about our budgetary limitations and needs to do the work that we do. I had prepared more to talk about that, but with limited time, I wanted to jump into some what I think are significant concerns around this plan. The beginning of the report says a lot of things that I think we agree upon that the IBZs need in terms of infrastructure. But when we get down to the details and we start looking at maps is where we start seeing significant issues. The Woodside IBC in Queens does not exist. The Ridgewood IBZ does not exist. Greenpoint, Williamsburg, parts of Red Hook. These places are basically being demapped from maybe not what they're saying technically demapped, but in terms of speculation, you're going to see people going out and buying properties now to try to capitalize on future changes to zoning. This is very harmful for industrial businesses in the future in those areas. So we would like a lot of time to analyze this, but then also really come together and work with DCP to create these maps in partnership with industrial business professionals, with our communities, to be able to have maps that make sense and support and preserve industrial businesses. So, yes, I'll leave it there.
Hi, good afternoon, committee and council members. My name is Charles Yu, and I'm the VP of Economic Development at the Long Island City Partnership. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today. First, we thank the council for passing IDEP that made the New York City Industrial Plan possible. With the release of the draft plan last week, we look forward to working with city agencies, the council, and community partners like the ones that are here today during the engagement period to fine-tune the plan. We support the land use framework for Long Island City, and speaking for Long Island City, we think it reflects our neighborhood's unique dynamics and align with what many stakeholders have shared in recent planning discussions. We also recognize that some aspect of the IBC policies may need to be updated to provide more flexibility and better reflect today's reality. While we view the framework proposed for Long Island City as a helpful approach, it is important to continue a thoughtful discussion about how to balance the need to strengthen industrial areas with the realities of mixed-use neighborhoods. The draft plan also underscores the importance of improving and optimizing industrial business support offered by the Department of Small Business Services. As a current IBSP ourselves, our organization sees firsthand how critical this support is. Over the past year, our team has provided one-on-one assistance to dozens of local businesses, including many minority and women-owned companies, helping them navigate real estate pressures, financing, energy savings, and operational challenges. Yet IBSP funding has remained flat for more than a decade, despite inflation and growing demands for our services. To deliver on the city's own goals outlined in the plan, we urge the council to help us increase IBSP funding by 50%, index future allocations to inflation, and extend contract to 3 years terms, providing stability needed to support industrial businesses and preserve good paying and family supporting jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, folks, for coming today. I think what all of us on the dais at least would really appreciate, and I know you folks are probably already thinking about this, but giving us any and all of the defined lines that you think need to be included or expanded beyond. I know we already have some of our IBZ maps, but if there are other areas or other streets that need to be included, we have 3 months till this plan is supposed to be final. And while we have a list of events that we know are going to happen per borough, that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't be engaging in consistent dialogue week to week on some of these items. So please use this as a resource as usual. And I'll take any designs of streets for me to send over as recommendation. Yeah,
Thank you.
of course. Any questions from members?
Right on.
Can we follow up about Ridgewood as well? Yes.
Okay, great. This panel is now excused. Thank you. Seeing no other in-person testimony, we will now turn to virtual panelists. For virtual panelists, once your name is called, a member of our staff will unmute you, and the Sergeant at Arms will set the timer and give you the go-ahead to begin. Please wait for the sergeant to announce that you may begin before delivering your testimony. I'll now call the first virtual panelist, which is Brady Mexel.
Starting time.
Good afternoon, Chair Farias and members of the Committee on Economic Development. I'm Brady Meixel with the Southwest Brooklyn Industrial Development Corporation. We're proud members of the Industrial Jobs Coalition. Industrial jobs are extremely important to our communities as they provide strong wages, low barriers to entry, and career pathways for those without college educations and for those whom English is a second language. Any strategy for equitable economic development must consider how to preserve and grow these important sectors in New York City. That's why we're enthusiastic supporters of the Council's Industrial Development Action Plan legislation. The draft NYC Industrial Plan released last week contains several strong recommendations for new and continued policies to support industrial businesses. However, notably, the current draft plan weakens the single most important aspect of city industrial policy, land use protections for industrially zoned land. Nearly 20 years ago, and through 3 very different mayoral administrations, the industrial business zone policy and its inherent promise to not allow residential rezonings within its territory has kept industrial businesses and their good paying, accessible jobs within the 5 boroughs. Now, with a draft NYC industrial plan that fails to uphold these vital protections and leaves much of the IBZs outside of the designated primary and secondary industrial areas, the likely market outcome will be conversion away from industrial use and loss of these quality accessible jobs. Given Council's directive in the IDAP legislation to plan to strengthen the industrial sector, we urge DCP to update its final version to uphold the IBZ structure and include all IBZ land as either primary or secondary industrial areas. The draft plan also seeks to optimize business supports via the IBSP program. Year after year, it becomes more difficult to continue to maintain our staffing and provide the number of free services, while the IBSP contract we rely on has remained static and has not been adjusted for inflation in many years. To ensure that industrial businesses can remain and thrive in New York City, and that IBSPs can continue to play our vital role in serving them, we ask this committee and City Council to help ensure that next year's city budget include a 3-year IBSP contract with a 50% increase and is indexed to inflation going forward. Thank you for your time today and for understanding the importance of the industrial sector to our city.
Perfect timing. Thank you. And I will continue the fight as I usually have had the last couple budgets on the IBSP funding. Maybe we should all convene and scheme on a different strategy this year. Seeing no one else virtually and no one in person, we've now heard from everyone who has signed up to testify. Okay. If we have inadvertently missed anyone who would like to testify in person, please visit the sergeant's table and complete a witness slip now. If we have inadvertently missed anyone who would like to testify virtually, please use the raise hand function in Zoom, and a member of our staff will call on you in order of hands raised. Seeing none, I would like to note again that written testimony will be reviewed in full by committee staff, may be submitted to the record up to 72 hours of the close of this hearing by emailing it to testimony@council.nyc.gov. And the hearing today is now adjourned.